Hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's joining us. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Trust Matters monthly free webinar. I'm very excited about our program today. As people are coming in, we've still got folks joining through the waiting room. So while we're waiting for everybody to get settled, let's just do a really quick chat to everybody. And I'm going to ask you to pull up your chat screen. Make sure that it's set to everyone in meeting, and then just type in for me your name and where you're from. For example, I'm Noelle Michaelenko. I'm the CEO of Trusted Advisor Associates, and I'm from Arlington, Virginia. Either where you're from or where you're currently located, they happen to be the same in my situation right now. Paul, welcome from across the pond. Mark, yes, the center of the world's innovation and Silicon Valley. I love it. We've got Georgia, the Midwest and Kansas, Columbus, Paducah, Kentucky. Vicki is going to be behind the scenes. She's with us here at Trusted Advisor, working as our producer. Ron from Fort Worth, Texas. Every time I say that, I hear myself. I don't know how many of you ever saw the movie with Sandra Bullock where she plays a, she's an FBI agent competing in the Miss America contest. And at the very end, they're announcing the winners. And William Shatner plays the judge, and he says, and representing the great tech state of Tejas. Always think about that. Oh, David Peel, I love your photo. That's so nice. Melissa from here on the East Coast. Great. So for those of you who are joining us, we're giving people a few more minutes to connect in. And while we're doing that, just if you could add into the chat, make sure you're set to chat to everyone, your name and where you're from. Got a great representation across the US, over into Europe. I think it's a little bit late for folks over in the Asia Pac region, middle of the night. Not that we've never had it before. Let's see. All right, we are 3 minutes in. I think that people will still be joining us, but we're going to go ahead and get started to be respectful of you all's time. As I mentioned, my name's Noelle Michaelenko. I'm the CEO of Trusted Advisor Associates, and I'm thrilled to welcome you and welcome you back, for some of you who are return participants, to our monthly virtual call on this month, Are You Stealing Your Client's Spotlight? A few things to keep in mind as we get started. This webinar is being recorded. You will be offered an opportunity to see the webinar. We'll send out links to the recording, the presentation, and some additional resources in probably by tomorrow, maybe Thursday at the latest. Our presentation this morning with Craig Choffe from Toronto, Canada, is going to be 30 minutes, plus an additional 15 minutes for questions and answers. If you have questions as we go along, please enter them into the chat. I will be monitoring the chat as we go through the presentation. If there's a question that's timely to interrupt Craig at that point, we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll hold questions for the end. And then if you're game, feel free to turn on your camera. It's always more fun to see the faces and get you to see each other as we're walking through these sometimes paradoxically difficult concepts around trust building. So finally, throughout the presentation, we'll be using the full feature set of Zoom. So we may be asking you to respond to polls, chat your answers to things, bring yourself on and off mute if you have questions or if you want to make comments, and then possibly we'll be annotating as well throughout. Not to worry, every time we get to one of these Zoom features, we'll walk you through how to do it in case you've never experienced that before. Finally, and foremost, we hope that you enjoy this presentation. Just a little bit of history about Trusted Advisor Associates. For those of you who haven't joined us before, we've spent 20 plus years working with professionals just like you around the globe, helping build deeper trust relationships. Now, I'm not going to stump for the books. I just want you to be aware that we do have 3 books on the topic of trust, and you can reach these books and many, many other resources via our trustedadvisor.com website. At the very end of the session today, I'll also come back to you with some additional resources that might be useful for you. Now, without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to our delivery associate, Craig Choffe, and let him introduce himself and launch us into the content. Craig, take it away.
Cheers. Thanks so much, Noelle. Thanks, everybody. Great to see everybody. Thank you for having me. So my name is Craig Choffe. I am from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, just a little bit north of the city center. I've been a facilitator for quite some time now. And one of the things I always like to focus in on is the human side of business. You know, I've worked for banks. I have a number of professional services firms as clients as well. And yet I've always been able to focus in on the human side of business. And one of the things that I also wanted to mention is that, you know, since we're all spending so much more time at home, you know, Canada specifically, like so many other parts of the world, has been in lockdown. I've been at home for the last little while with my high school sweetheart. Kath and I met in 1987, and we are still going strong. And I'm also here at home with my son, Mason, who is now 23. And actually, Mason factors into one of the stories that I want to share with you in a moment. But as I mentioned, I've always been focused in on the human side of business. And one of my favorite Dale Carnegie quotes is that, you know, communicating with another human being is one of the most complex things that we do. And I think Noelle and I are both here today to talk about the fact that there are things that we can remember as best practices. There are little mindsets that we can use to make these complex communications so much more effective. But I think the biggest thing that I wanted to state right up front, this stuff is hard. And here we are with a provocative title about, are you stealing your client's spotlight? Nobody wakes up in the morning saying, I can't wait to dominate a conversation. It's just, unfortunately, maybe when we're in the moment, we're not focused, we're not present, we haven't done enough preparation, we don't have the right mindset to show up in a way where we're not dominating or usurping an entire conversation. And to speak to how hard this is, one of my other favorite quotes is to teach is to learn twice. And one of the interesting things is that if my son and my wife were here, they would probably say, hey, Craig, please keep teaching as long as you can, because as I mentioned earlier, none of this stuff is easy. And the quick story that I wanted to share with you actually involves my son, Mason. Now, I would imagine that most of you can imagine, whether you're parents or not, but all of us have client relationships, we have team relationships, and then we have personal and family relationships. My relationship with my son is probably the most important one to me, and yet it's also probably one of the most challenging. So here's my quick story. I am literally about to leave for the airport. My bag is packed. I've got my suit on. I'm literally rushing down the stairs because the car is waiting outside. And I noticed that this was a few years ago when my son was in high school. His door was still closed and the light was still off. There's no way that should be the case. She should have already been up and getting ready to go to school. So I knock on the door and go in. And at this point, I'm looking at my watch the whole time. And he's actually kind of still asleep. And I'm kind of, oh, geez, I hope he's not sick. When I motioned to wake him up, he unfortunately said that he wasn't feeling good emotionally and that he was really struggling in high school and he was really having a hard time, you know, literally getting up in the morning to get motivated to go to school. Now, bear in mind, I'm a professional facilitator who talks about empathy, emotional intelligence, and trust all the time. I probably had a leader's guide for how important communicating with empathy is in my bag that was sitting outside my son's door. So this is clearly a moment that matters. This is a time where I could actually demonstrate how to communicate with someone in the best way possible. As my son continues to explain some of the challenges that he's having, I actually lean in, and in my rushed state, the first thing that I said to him is, I know, son, I was in high school once as well. And I started telling him about my experiences in high school. Now, can we just pause for a second? Let's actually even see it in chat. Can I ask, does everybody think that that was a good thing for me to say or a bad thing for me to say? So let's just see it in chat. Me saying to him as my immediate response is, son, I know because I was in high school as well. Right. Okay. So here's the interesting thing, right? All of us are saying, hey, way to go, hashtag fail dad. right, is literally what my moment was. In my head, I thought, oh, well, look, I can connect with him and I can actually relate to him. Of course, that's a good intention. But right now, Mason did not want to hear about my experiences in high school. And yet so many of us do this automatically. So everyone, my goal today is in this very short period of time, we're going to be able to get a better mindset. We're going to be able to have a better approach that when you're faced with a client situation, a team situation, even a family or friend situation, that we're going to show up the way that we would want to show up to really make it where that communication, that conversation leaves things for the better. So with that in mind, let's focus in on a couple of the key topics. So we keep talking about, are you stealing your client spotlight? We know that clearly part of what we wanted to talk about today is listening. So here's my question. And since we're literally just at the end of the Olympics, I wanted to give it a little bit of flair. So I'm asking all of you in our first poll today, do you know any gold medal listeners? So I'm not talking about average, I'm talking about absolutely gold medal listeners. So the great thing is that we're going to have a Zoom poll for you to take in a few moments, and you can see you've got your options A through D. Let's make sure that we have an opportunity to take a look at, do you know any gold medal listeners? And we'll actually fill this out over the poll. So let's go ahead and bring up the poll, and we'll have everyone vote on where they are with gold medal listeners, please. Okay, we got some answers coming in here. We'll just wait for the final tally, and we'll take a look at how we're doing. How many? We got about 17 people strong. Let's see how 17 people from around the world, how many gold medal listeners we know. So it looks like we can, there we go. We're going to close the poll here. So what's interesting is that none of you put that you know lots of people. There was a few of you that said, you know a few people. Some of you said one or two, but then what's scary about this is that even though it was only one person, isn't it interesting that there's a lot of people around that would pretty well say, yeah, I don't know anybody personally or professionally. And if we're here to actually help you with your client relationships and actually make it where you can differentiate yourself, I definitely wanted that if I had any of your clients on this exact same call, that they would actually be thinking about you when they say, yeah, absolutely, I do know a gold medal listener. So that's indeed our first topic for today. But let's actually then focus in on, and that's great, if we can close this poll, and I'm going to go to the next slide. And let's take a look at this one here. And the next one is clearly really leveraging the topic of today, right? Do you know anyone, personally or professionally, who talks a lot or steals conversations? By the way, everyone, my hashtag dad fail example that I gave at the beginning, I would argue would be an example of me stealing the spotlight away from my son. My son didn't want to talk about my high school experience. He wanted to talk about his high school experience. So let's bring up the poll again. And can I ask everyone to see whether or not you know people that show up like this, that usurp conversations, dominate coffees, dominate meetings? Let's see. So isn't this scary? It looks like everyone's answered, which is terrific. So we can close the poll. Isn't this scary? Take a look at that, right? Definitely no one answered the, oh, sure, I know lots of gold medal listeners. But unfortunately, all of us answered much in the case of that we know lots of people that are like that. The one comment that I use, and once again, no one does this on purpose, but I know I have a number of people that I know that desperately need to be introduced to the question mark, right? That they literally are in a position where they don't have that mindset of curiosity. They don't have that mindset of being focused in on the other person. I'd actually love to do this, if you don't mind. I'd love someone maybe just to come off mute, maybe someone that answered, which it looks like the majority of us did, saying that you know lots of people. If someone could just come off mute and describe this one person that you have in mind when you're thinking about someone who dominates conversations?
For those of you scrambling to come off mute, just move your cursor to the lower left and you'll find a little microphone icon. Click on that to unmute yourselves.
Thanks, Noelle. I'm going to call you out, but Jim Brown, I thought I saw yourself come off mute. Did you have something that you wanted to share?
Sure. I mean, I think that some of the people that I know fall into a little bit of the category you mentioned, where no matter what I would start talking about, they would always turn it about to some part of their own life. Oh, I did that, or I know a guy, or let me tell you my opinion, and immediately the conversation just completely reverts to that person, and I barely get in a word after that.
Yeah, absolutely. Isn't it interesting, right? I mean, you could talk about a great restaurant that you went to and you wanted to share your experience, and then somebody suddenly talks about a different type of restaurant and now all of a sudden dominates. Once again, nobody's doing it to be mean or doing it, on purpose, but we seem to know a ton of people that are like that. So Jim, cheers. Thank you very much. Anyone else, any thoughts about this? And Noelle obviously included, and Heather, I saw you come off mute.
I'll even go on video. Found that one too. So don't tell her if you ever meet her, but my mom is one of these. And so I find myself being selective about what I go to her about, because my issue or problem always spurs a story of her own. And like, if you don't know her, it can be sad and overwhelming. And I recognize it's just that social piece of her. And she just thinks the intentions are there. She wants to relate to me and she's trying to empathize, but it's bulldozing and it's sad. So that's my experience. I've learned how to, what to go with her about and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Hey, Heather, I'm going to jump in because I have a question for you here, Heather. And, I share by the way, your experience with my own mother. And I think it's great that we now have 3 classic examples of parent-child interactions building off of Craig's, right? What's like, I can hear some sadness in your voice when you say, oh, I can't go to my mother for certain things. How does that leave you feeling?
Yeah, I didn't know this was going to be therapy too. No, it's definitely frustrating. And I think as we've gotten older, I've tried to push back a little bit more and like, okay, Mom, my turn, or like, you're not allowed, let me go first and then you can go. So I've tried to do some things, but it's definitely sad. And I think the big part is she just has no idea, and there's not really a good way to say like, okay, Mom, but you're taking over a lot. So I've tried a little things, but it's it's not ideal.
Yeah. And Heather and Jim and everyone else, and thank you obviously for completing the poll. And once again, isn't it interesting that I think the true power of this content and everything that we're talking about is it is not client specific, right? The exact same practices, the exact same issues that we're talking about show up in every relationship that we have. And Heather and Jim, and for everyone else, I didn't do it on purpose to my son. Nobody does this on purpose, but we would argue it's because of the fact that maybe they're coming at it from the wrong mindset, or maybe they're not focusing in on some of the key best practices. And if I may, and I don't mean to make light of this, and it's a bit of a joke and it didn't show up today, but if you remember, one of the responses in this option was, do you know anyone who bulldozes, and Heather, talk about a powerful expression, right? I don't think bulldozer and trusted advisor necessarily have an equal sign next to them, right? I'm pretty sure that those are opposites. But nobody actually said, no one comes to mind. Now, there's no other way to put it. I ask this question a lot, and I've had it sometimes where even in my in-person programs, some people actually say, no one comes to mind. And I hate to say it, but what I say next is out loud as I'm saying, if you're one of those people where nobody like this comes to mind, that means there's a good chance that that person is you. Right. And, hopefully it gets a couple of laughs because we're trying to at least be casual about it. But you know what, we all need to learn about how we show up in conversations. And if I may, before we move on, as I mentioned, I do a lot of programs for large global professional services firms. And one of my favorite client examples, once again, about no one's doing this on purpose, is it was a proposal meeting. Everything was very important. 3 senior executives meeting 3 people from the firm. They only had 1 hour. And in that hour, the first 15 minutes, each of those individuals took 5 minutes to introduce themselves. So now you are 25% into a meeting where everyone felt that the best way for them to show up was to credentialize themselves, pretty well recite their LinkedIn profile out loud. And that meant that 15 minutes into a 60-minute meeting, clients hadn't said a word, and all they were doing was listening to someone who was not them. So it's just interesting about the mindset, even how you introduce yourself. What do your PowerPoint slides look like? How long does it take for a client to see something that they recognize versus your quals and your value propositions? It's these mindsets, but indeed for us tactically, it shows up in so many different ways in which we communicate with our clients. So that's indeed something that we want to talk about. So of course, we couldn't go too far without having a terrific quote from our friend, Mr. Charlie Green. So I want everyone to take a look at this quote, and I'd love to have a couple of people come off mute and tell us what resonates with you about this one. This is where I try to be a gold medal listener and let silence do the heavy lifting and invite someone just to come off mute or even put it into the chat. By all means, you can vote either way, but put it into the chat or come off mute and just say what resonates most with you about this quote, please.
Hey, Craig, this is Jim Brown again. I'll just jump in.
Sure, thanks, Jim.
And since, let's see, do I have this right? Since Heather did it, I'll jump off of my camera as well. So I think the thing that resonates here with me is something that I think I learned in one of the Trusted Advisor trainings, is that if you're too busy trying to think of the next thing to say to keep the conversation, then you're clearly not doing deep listening. And I find myself doing that all the time. So I need to, figure out ways to get past that, because I'm worried about lulls in the conversation, which can actually be productive if it makes sense, but I tend to worry too much about the direction of the conversation instead of just listening.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jim, and thank you so much, right? And once again, it's kind of like listening all the way through, right? And being okay with not having an immediate response or an immediate next question, because we actually want to be able to pause long enough and digest. So I actually have an antidote, if you will, and I want to share this quick story, and then we're going to be able to link it directly to our friend, the trust equation. So this is what I do for a living. I talk about client relationships. I talk about customer experience. I talk about sales and business development. So I'm always on the lookout for good and bad stories when I am the client, when I'm actually the consumer. So here's my quick story. So when I started my own practice, this was a few years ago, I decided to make the switch. And I said, okay, I'm going to go all in and go all in on Apple. So I walked into an Apple store at my local mall in Newmarket, Ontario. Now, whether you're an Apple fan or not, I'm hoping that all of you have seen or been in an Apple store. It is a white, well-lit palace. It is beautiful, it is minimalistic, and there is product everywhere. There's phones, there's watches, there's laptops, there's monitors. The music's playing, everything's well lit. It's literally a palace to their product. So the store, of course, is very busy. I meet with somebody and I say, listen, I need to buy a number of different items, but I'd like to talk to somebody. That's great. They introduced me to a gentleman by the name of Ralph that I can see on his name tag. So he comes over and I'm sitting here, remember, this is what I do for a living. And I'm kind of going, I'm going to be interested to see how this sales interaction goes with this guy, Ralph. So Ralph comes over. First thing he says to me, so what brings you into Apple today? Okay, that's a pretty good question. Actually, I'm here, I need to look into maybe some new tech for my business. Oh, okay. If it's all right with you, I want to ask you a few questions. So Craig, what is it that you do for a living? And I'm kind of going, this is off to a good start. Meanwhile, by the way, everyone, we're surrounded by product, right? He has not said the word laptop. He has not said the word phone. He's literally, every single thing that's come out of his mouth up to this point has had a question mark at the end. So what do you do for a living? What kind of tech do you use right now? What's working? What's not working? Are you a super user for any applications? He just kept asking me question, question, question. I'm indeed amazed. Even though we are surrounded by product, he's not jumping to solution. There's no features and benefits. There's no value proposition. He is 100% focused on diagnosing me. I literally feel like I'm in the doctor's office. So he continues on with the questions to the point where he says, you know, well, Craig, well, what's working, what's not working? And I said to him, well, actually, one of the bigger challenges I'm having right now is I always need to make sure that my calendar is up to date on all of my devices, because right now there's times where my BlackBerry calendar, yes, that's how long ago it was, is not synced up with my laptop calendar. And then he pauses and he looks at me and he goes, well, Craig, it sounds like the existing tech that you're using for your business sucks. So at this point, I have to say that even though we're surrounded by product, he did not jump to solution. He asked me a ton of questions. It was probably the best experience that I've had because I felt like I was in the spotlight, not the product, not his expertise. I was in the spotlight. I would argue, and this is the painful part and why I did the polls earlier, I would argue that Ralph at Apple Canada, in Newmarket, Ontario, Canada, knows more about what I do for a living than some of my friends do, because of the fact that clearly his mindset going into that conversation was the spotlight isn't on Apple, the spotlight is on Craig. And the way I want to bask him in that spotlight is I want to show up with a lot of great questions and I want to get to know him and not talk about me or not talk about Apple. Now, let me just pause. Let's see it in the chat on a scale of 1 to 10, based on what I just described to you. 1 is an absolutely horrible exchange and horrible experience. And 10 is, wow, this guy Ralph is a gold medal listener and showing up as a trusted advisor. Now that you've heard the story, let's just see it in the chat. On a scale of 1 to 10, what rating would you give my friend Ralph? Okay, Felipe, Michael. Yeah, like he absolutely crushed it. And so needless to say, you can see with the earbuds and whatever, I am now an Apple fan. He did a fantastic job. And in all of my training programs, I use him as an example of how we want to show up. Now, everyone, I'm hopeful that some of you are familiar with the trust equation or the trustworthiness equation. But if you're not, one of the things that I really wanted to focus in on is if we're talking about not stealing our clients or our family members or our friends or team members spotlight, the trust equation is a fantastic reminder and tool to actually help us not do that. So when you look at what are the key elements of trustworthiness, we can see the blue parts that are above the line are credibility and reliability. So how we show up, our words and our actions, these are indeed the things that we can know are key elements and how we can show up to be trustworthy. But then what's interesting is that I want to draw your attention to, and they're color coded for a reason, but when we look at I, which is for intimacy, it's about, how connected are you with the other person? How much of a relationship are you able to build in your different conversations and your interactions? And then the other one that you can really see, and there's a ton of great work on the website. There's clearly a ton of great work on it in all of the books that Noelle mentioned, but is this whole notion of self-orientation. Are you focused on you or are you focused in on the other person? So I'd love to actually see, now that we understand the different components of the trust equation, remember that this is a mathematical formula. And the reason why the S is on the bottom, the S is the denominator, which means no matter how well you do on the top, everything is divided, if you will, by what's on the denominator. So if you have high self-orientation, you're actually going to take away some of that trustworthiness. If you have low self-orientation, like our friend Ralph does, you can indeed gain the trust. So let me actually see in the chat, which one of these trust elements do you think my friend Ralph really did a great job doing? Let's see this in the chat, because most of you gave this an 8, 9, or 10 out of 10. What would you say is some of the better things that Ralph did reconciled with the trust equation, please? So Donald, you've got the intimacy piece, which is great. Let's hear from other people, please. Yeah. Hey, Mark, and if you don't mind, I just wanted to do a quick call out. I just saw, Mark, you were specific and you actually included both. Mark, you've got high I and low S. Mark, if you don't mind, can you just come off mute and tell us a little bit more about what you heard and how you think Ralph is showing up like this?
Sure. Suffice it to say, I'm not wearing a suit and tie right now, but imagine I am. Well, of course, with all of the, the focus on getting to know you and probing deeply, that comes through clear. But on top of that, as you described it, not a focus on his ability to sell something, his ability to make a commission, his ability to jump to the solution and kind of show off the answer. And I've been to some of those Apple stores and I've seen just the opposite, right? Where somebody says, look how cool this is. So,
right.
So that's what resonated with me.
Cheers, Mark. Thank you so much. And I appreciate being able to do the shout out. Noelle, obviously for you and a call to anyone else want to come off mute and talk about how can you see the trust equation show up with our friend Ralph? Michael, I think I saw you come off mute. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I think he took a real risk by telling you your current technology sucked.
Yeah.
So that's, when you take a risk like that, you're being vulnerable. And I mean, you could have reacted negatively to that comment. So that's probably a high I.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember, right, one of the things we always speak about is that there's no trust without risk. And if anything, the fact that he used that, I felt heard, understood, and acknowledged. Like I practically hugged the guy because, right, like I felt like there's no way he's going to make a statement like that if he hasn't been listening at a gold medal level, right? That statement simply wouldn't be available to him, but he was able to understand the tone and the challenges that I was having as part of my business practice. Michael, cheers. Thanks so much. Hey, Noelle, I think we've talked about this story in the past. Any thoughts or comments that you wanted to add about our friend Ralph and more importantly, our trust equation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just gonna, I'm gonna say out loud and dive deeper into the comment I just posted in the chat. And it was, I think it was Mark that made the connection between high credibility and self-orientation, right? When he said, I've been in stores like that and I've seen people who are not able to do what Ralph did. And it's one of the subtleties of self-orientation, which is that thing that we value very much about ourselves. With credibility, it's appearing smart or having answers. With reliability, it's being dependable. With intimacy, it's being liked, right? Those things that are valued, those are the very things that when we aren't paying attention can set off our self-orientation trigger. So somebody who is very proud of their ability to sell the product, to understand the products, to be able to share with you what product is best, their natural tendency is going to be to demonstrate to you how smart they are. And that's their S, kind of in a very sneaky, subtle way, spiking up. And so just something to keep in mind for those of you who are thinking about how not to hijack a conversation, steal the spotlight, is really understand what's important to you. And when you're in when you're in a situation where that's coming to light, just be super self-aware.
Yeah. Yeah. And Noelle, what I think is great about that is I think it really speaks to the fact that no one's doing this on purpose, right? And if anyone, a lot of times we're thinking, well, hold it, I can actually earn trust by maybe really spending a lot of time introducing myself, right? Where if anything, we now realize, and once again, as Noelle mentioned, a lot of the stuff is like a paradox. Well, hold it. Well, what do you mean if I talk less about me, somehow I'm going to be more trusted? How does that work? Well, I think we're hopeful that between all the stories that we've shared today, that you can see exactly how that comes off.
Craig,
please go.
Before you go on to this, I just really quickly want to underscore that point, because I love the fact that your story is about developing very rapid trust with a complete stranger.
Yep.
You know nothing at all about Ralph except that he's focused on you.
Absolutely. And if anything, and talk about a bias opportunity, when I looked at him, he was a young man. And I kind of went, be interesting to see how this goes. Sure, there's no other way to put it. And yet I deal with very senior people around the world at professional services firms and banks. And I still argue that this 20-something has given me the best client experience that I've had in recent memory. So once again, it just, I think Noelle really hit it on the head, that so much of it goes into what is your mindset even going into this conversation. So here's my hopeful thing that will change the game for all of you, is we keep talking about clearly looking at the trust equation will hopefully trigger so many of these different mindsets and some of these different approaches. But one of the things that I like to do is, okay, hold it, let's be really, really specific. And here's my challenge to all of you, and I want to see this in chat. Clearly, Noelle and I want this to be real for you. This is not a theoretical 45 minutes. We want you to be able to apply it. And wouldn't it be great that you could apply it in your very next conversation, no matter who it's with? But let me challenge all of you to think about your next client conversation. So I have something that I just like to call, what's your ideal listening percentage? If you could actually get out a magic wand and say, my next conversation is going to be so great that I'm going to be able to execute against how much I want to listen versus how much I want to talk. Now, clearly, given the different relationships and different scenarios and situations that you're in, there's not going to be one perfect listening percentage for all of us, but I want you to make this custom. I want you to make this real. So think about your next client conversation, and let's see this in the chat. What would be your ratio between listening and talking for your next client conversation, please? Let's see it in the chat. Okay, cool. So for all of you that go into client conversations or client meetings with multiple people, how many of you would love to actually be able to declare this out loud to all the members of your team, so you're all on the same page about how long you should be talking versus how long you should be listening? Is there a way in which all of you could actually have this as a reminder, even write these numbers down on a piece of paper? Yeah, and Michael, and thank you to everyone, right, for putting it in. Most of us want to go in where we're listening more than we're talking. And one of the things that I just wanted as a quick reminder to everybody, let's say that I think I saw some of them that actually put in an 80-20. And of course, there's going to be situations where that would be the ideal. That's an hour meeting. That's 48 minutes. 48 minutes of you listening. Now, that's a gold medal listener. Indeed, that's why I say ideal. I think we definitely want to get to that point. But once again, let's really hunker down and recognize that that would be 48 minutes of listening. I would argue, though, that my friend Ralph hit 80-20. He did, right? It was all about me. And that's something that I think that I really wanted you to be able to bear in mind. Now, with that in mind, because I want to make sure that we have some time for questions, I have something really clever that I wanted to show you. And the reason why I can say it's clever is that it's not mine. I was doing a program for a pharma group, running a trusted advisor workshop, and somebody actually came up with this little graphic. So if we all know that listening is important, but then we also know the beauty and the power of the trust equation, this was indeed what they wrote down. It's the word listen, but you want really big high I and you want incredibly low S. I have this written down. I'm hoping that this might be a wonderful prompt for some of you that you can write down, put it on a Post-it, put it right next to your camera as a wonderful reminder how to bring some of these elements into play. But my other one, and by the way, everyone, guilty as charged, I have been introduced to this because I myself was over contributing. And thankfully, someone was able to pull me aside and coach me in the moment, but said, Craig, I'd like to introduce you to WAIT. Why am I talking? Between these two, along with your trust equation, I'm really hopeful that all of us can show up with the mindset and the prompt to indeed be in a position where the next conversation we have with anyone, we can absolutely make sure to put them in the spotlight. So with that being said, Noelle, I think we want to make sure that we have some time for any questions or thoughts.
Yeah. We have about 5 minutes left. So if you have questions, you can raise your hand and come off mute or enter them into the chat. While we're waiting for people to think about that, Craig, I know one thing that pops to mind, well, it's a question I get often when I do workshops, and that is this: 48 minutes out of 60 minutes is a lot of time to spend listening, and they're paying for our advice, right? We're not there because they want a friend. We're there because they have a business need. How do I know it's time to start talking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I think is terrific about that notion is that, once again, this is why it's such a great reminder to say, hold it, well, 48 minutes. And once again, especially if you're charging the client for that time, they're going to start going, hold it, stand by. Aren't you supposed to be the expert? I think there's a couple of pieces that I would speak to that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with actually being very overt at the beginning of any conversation, saying what are the objectives and the outcomes of the conversation. One of my favorite Charlie Green quotes is that I want to understand this problem almost as well as you do when you're actually talking to the client. And in an effort to understand that problem almost as well as you do, I would like to take some time to ask you some questions and to gather some information. And the other piece that I also have said out loud to a lot of my clients is this whole notion of, so many of us wouldn't necessarily object to a doctor or any physical or any medical practitioner asking us questions. If anything, we would be excited for a medical practitioner to ask us questions, because then we know that they won't be guilty of malpractice. So there have been times where I've actually said at the beginning of a meeting where maybe I am aiming for an 80-20, I might actually say, Noel, I'd like to spend this next hour asking you some questions so I can really understand what your situation is. And then, to your point, Noel, recognizing when then I have permission, just like a doctor would be, to say, now's the time for me to say, this is what I've heard. This is what then I actually feel, or my point of view, or recommended options or solutions.
Great. So I heard two themes in that, Craig. One is to set the expectation up front. So they're aware that you are intentionally asking questions, right? There's no doubt, like, oh, wow, does this person not know what I'm talking about? They know that you're doing it intentionally. And then two is the sequencing is important, right? Let them know what you're going to do, listen effectively, and then really get to the solutioning piece at the end after they've shared everything.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And once again, and then I think that there can even be more confidence that we're not jumping to solution, that we actually really understand it. And as pedestrian as it is, because it's a very small transaction compared to your client transactions, but I completely felt that Ralph got me, right? I handed over my credit card and said, make whatever recommendation you want. And if you saw my desk, I have Apple stuff everywhere. And it's because of the fact that I actually felt like he's not going to steer me wrong, because he gets it. So it's a wonderful thing. Looks like we've got a question in the chat. Michael, how do you do this effectively and consistently with coworkers with whom I interact with on a regular basis? Michael, do you mind coming off mute? Tell us a little bit more. So in your interactions with coworkers, about how can we show up by putting a spotlight on them?
So a lot of our, in our organization, there's normal and probably healthy friction between, say, sales and operations, but the sales team has been working really hard on becoming better trusted advisors, while the ops team isn't. And eventually it gets a little fatiguing to always feel like you're being the person who's trying to be the good listener and reaching out and that bridge, when the self-awareness of your counterparts is not there, and their leadership isn't pushing them to be more self-aware. It just, I'm looking for strategies to take it beyond the initial, trust building equation to a longer term thing. Maybe even to the point of, in a healthy way, calling someone out and saying, hey, we need a little reciprocation here. going on. So this is a different type of environment than selling a client that I'm referring to, but just
Right.
I think for us to be effective with our clients, we need to have the whole team on board with the same message.
Right. And Michael, and by all means, one thing I wanted to offer, I wanted to be mindful of the time, you know, definitely happy to stay on after the call. Michael, I know one of the strategies that hopefully you can see that Noelle and I tried to use here is that, is there a great story, Michael, that maybe you could tell a wonderful success story of what actually did happen with a client interaction that you could hopefully use as an anchor, right? To be able to try to set that cultural tone, to be able to say, we need more conversations that go like this and less conversations that go like that. But I hear your pain because of the fact that, yeah, once again, you can have whole job families that are trying to do things in a very specific mindset. And then you have whole other groups within the same organization that are unfortunately at times almost counterproductive. So I think that that's definitely worthy of further conversation. But forgive me, I want to be mindful of everybody's time. But Michael, thank you for bringing that up. I'm happy to stay on afterwards.
And Michael, I'll send in the resources email that I send out. I will include something specific to address that situation. So Craig, I want to say thank you for an excellent discussion around keeping the spotlight on your clients, or at least learning how to avoid stealing it. Let's go back one, and just really quickly from you all before everybody drops, what is your biggest takeaway from our time together this morning or this afternoon? You could just open your chat and type in the biggest thing that you learned in our time together. And then while you're thinking about that, Craig, go ahead and switch to the next one. And Vicki, I'm going to ask you to pop up a quick poll just so we can get a sense if this webinar was helpful to you. So really quickly give us your feedback in the poll and any key takeaways you have. Great. Good. All right. Thanks. And then Craig, on the final slide here, there are some questions, or sorry, one more. Here are some resources. And again, I'll send out more resources in our thank you email tomorrow or Thursday. You should keep an eye out for that. But we have tons of resources available on this and many other topics through our website. Obviously, there are the books. We have some online self-led learning. And then you can stay with us to get trust tips and join the conversation on social media. Right. So, and for those of you who have never taken the TQ, you can also assess your own trustworthiness with either a free mini report or a full paid report. So great expectations. With that, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Keep an eye out for our resources follow-up email, and welcome to the Trusted Advisor community. Thank you for participating. Have a great afternoon, evening to everybody who joined us. Thank you.